So we've had angry renter, happy renter, and now we're going to have odd renter because, well, Tim Lowe, I'm willing to bet, is the only person in this room who has lived in a Horsebox, among other odd places where he stayed for, what, 4 months?
4 months, yeah.
4 months. Tim, you tell him the story.
Good evening. My name is Tim Lowe. Until recently, I worked at Knight Frank in our private rented sector, and I've recently gone out on my own. And I'm going to tell you a bit about my sort of story and how I got into this in the first place. I ran a project a couple of years ago called Low Cost Living, a bit of a play on my surname. And the premises was to go out there and rent 6 different types of property within Zone 2 for less than £500 a month, including all bills. So why did I start this? I mean, it's pretty easy these days when you look into any sort of newspaper. There's a lot of media out at the moment. I was actually renting a 5-bed down in Brixton with some mates from university, getting a paid pretty low salary by my employer at the time. And I had a pretty bad landlord who was pretty unresponsive to a lot of the issues we had there. And I started thinking about what is actually out there if you want to go down. And actually, I know £500 is quite an extreme example, but after a few beers with my new boss at the time, I was pretty confident that there was a couple of opportunities out there. I teamed up with Estates Gazette, which is one of the main property publications, and in turn with the Evening Standard to put this investigation together. And without really realising what I got myself into, I found myself here. I don't know if many of you are familiar with property guardian schemes. If you're looking for security, this is probably your worst nightmare because you're given 2 weeks' notice at any time. But this cost me £400 a month. Above a quick fit garage in Gospel Oak, which is a fantastic part of London, I have to say. The negatives were I didn't have any windows in my room. I had this skylight, and on one particular day, a pigeon decided to come in there. We shared one shower between 18 people. We had rat infestations and all sorts of problems with it. But I have to say, it was a very enjoyable experience because of the people I met there. And I met some very colourful characters, and what was very interesting was I wasn't alone in this trying to beat the system, and there's a whole movement of young people out there who all they really care about is 2 things, and that's price and location. One particular character who is slightly more left field, but I thought he'd be very good to share with you, is a gentleman called Twiggy Garcia. I don't know if anyone here has ever come across Twiggy Garcia. But Twiggy and myself were talking one evening, and I'll show you a picture of Twiggy. Here's Twiggy. And he sort of sees himself as a sort of DJ, blogger / activist. And he has over 10,000 followers on Twitter. And I was asking him, how did this happen? And Twiggy at the time was working at Tramshed in Shoreditch as a barman. And Tony Blair came in with his family. It was Ewan Blair's birthday at the time, and they went to a private room. And one of Twiggy's lifetime ambitions was to citizen arrest Tony Blair. And he couldn't believe his luck when this opportunity arose, and he was given the room of waitering on this. So Twiggy went into the room. He put one hand on Tony Blair's shoulder, and he uttered these words to him. Mr. Blair, this is a citizen arrest for a crime against peace, namely your decision to launch an unprovoked war against Iraq. I'm inviting you to accompany me to a police station to answer the charge. Now, bearing in mind, this has actually happened 5 times to Tony Blair, so he's kind of quite used to it. And he straight away started demanding Twiggy give some answers on the current situation in Syria, at which stage Twiggy got bundled out and moved on. From Gospel Oak, one last thing, again, just sort of reinforcing that location. It's part of London I've never spent any time, but it was amazing going back from work, going for a swim and using Hampstead Heath. From Gospel Oak, I moved to an HMO. This is a house of multiple occupants, and it's actually seeing a bit of revival in the property industry because people are beginning to realise this is quite a profitable way of targeting the student market, the young professional market, moving to London. This is run by a company called The Collective. If you've seen them in the press, they've just launched a 550-bed scheme in Old Oak Common. This one itself was 50 beds, and their concept's very simple. We're going to build very small rooms. They're going to be incredibly efficient. While I was staying here, I had my laundry done once a week. There was a concierge desk there. They organised activities. I know it says the price here, I got it for £500, but they were looking for a bit of PR. It's actually a bit more than that. So that's a slight negative to it. And I actually found some of the social aspects, because of the amount of people coming to London, such a demand for it, I found a lot of overseas students actually finding these as quite good pads. But I had a very enjoyable time all the same. People often ask me what was the hardest part about doing this project. And it wasn't so much the places I stayed in. I'm quite nomadic in my personality, so I'm quite easy about sort of moving on every now and again. It was actually finding spaces for less than £500 in London. One thing I'd always really wanted to do was live on a houseboat. And I spent an afternoon walking up and down around Victoria Park, knocking on houseboat doors and asking people if they'd let me come and stay with them for 3 weeks. And what I didn't realise is a houseboat they're a very protective network of people, and they kind of see them. Sorry, does anyone here live on a houseboat? We have one here. They see this as a lifestyle, and they've realised that a lot of people are seeing houseboats as an affordable option of living in London. And so they're very protective to this. And I got all sorts of answers, but basically no one wanted me to live there, and no one wanted me to write an article about them as well. So I went on a Facebook forum called the London Boaters, and I posted this message. Just excuse, I was just trying to come across as a very, easygoing, and I know this is slightly over the top, but dear London Boaters, I'm running a project looking at different types of affordable accommodation in London, and I desperately need some help. I'm looking to spend 3 weeks living on a houseboat over August, September, and hopefully write an article about what a great experience it was, a short film. I'm 26 and I have a fishing boat on the Isle of Wight. I just tried to relay I had some form of boating experience, even though the fishing boat sort of resembles a bit more of a tub. And I'm quite able with engines, again, a slight exaggeration, if that helps. If anyone could help or know someone who could, I would be very grateful indeed. Hope you're enjoying the fine weather. Many thanks, Tim. I was actually met with a barrage of abuse by these boaters, and I've actually picked out the 3 best comments. Martin Catterall said, funny how nobody ever wants to do this in November, which scored him 9 likes. Stephanie Dixon said, I'm going to suggest that your research has already been skewed as you assume it's going to be great and you enjoy it. A better idea would be to buy your own boat and live on it for a year. Only then will you understand the heights and pitfalls of it. Time was slightly in essence on my 3-week trip, so I had to ignore that one. But the best came from a lady called Lenny Mann, who said, I'm doing a research assignment on how people in penthouse apartments live. With their hot and cold running water, 240-volt electronics at the flick of a switch. I'm looking to stay in one of these apartments from late October, mid-March. If anyone can help me out, I'd be heaps grateful. I've lived in and around houses, apartments before, so I know generally how they work, and loads of my mates live in them and I'm sound. Inbox, if you know anything, must be pet-friendly, which I have to say I did find quite amusing. But anyway, I did actually manage to find a houseboat. Unfortunately for me, my houseboat was the only houseboat which didn't have any running water or electricity. A very nice lad called Dan, who is a similar age to me, had bought this. Rather than buying a house, he'd spent 50 grand on this boat, and he was spending the next 6 months doing it up. So as part of my rent, I helped him when I got back from work, and we got to know each other pretty closely by our sort of, you can see from the showering there, and there was very little in terms of privacy when going to the loo. I moved on from here to Wimbledon. I don't know if any of you have seen this in the press. This is the YMCA have developed a Y-Cube, and it's basically a way of providing a single unit for young people coming through the YMCA network who don't want to go and have a house share with someone. They need their own space. And it's a modular, off-site built technique. You're beginning to see these propping up around Europe at the moment, and it's very much been hailed as a bit of a solution to the housing crisis. This is a car park it's on. It can be stacked up, and it costs about £35,000 to build. So it's very, very cheap. I'll talk about these in a bit more detail on, but it was actually a very interesting space to go and stay in. After 3 weeks there, I found myself slightly down again as an overnight security guard in Hammersmith. I only paid £25 a week, and I had to spend 4 nights between 7 in the evening till 7 in the morning living in this building. As you can say, the bathroom and some of the other sort of fittings and furniture weren't quite what I was expecting. From here, I moved down to South Bank. If any of you ever go down where the ITV Tower is, you'll see this development opposite. It's by a Coin Street Community Builders. And there's a plot of land, I believe in the 80s, which was going to be redeveloped into offices. And under Ken Livingstone and a host of other people within the area, they got together and they said this housing should be used for affordable options. So this is a cooperative where everyone living and renting within the schemes, they control how the buildings operate. I lived with a very lovely Scottish family who had 2 young boys. And I believe for a 4-bed there, bearing in mind you are literally bang on the Thames, they were paying about £100 a week. Unfortunately, very few of these exist in London. They also have a very big waiting list, but they're very selective to key workers living and working in the area. The lady I was with was a nurse, her husband was a teacher, and I think these kind of stories are fantastic. Unfortunately, there are so few of them. My final trip took me here. I was really stuck at this stage for another affordable option, and I remember seeing a good mate of mine at a festival selling muesli out the back of a Horsebox, and I wasn't quite sure if I'd been imagining this or not, so I called him up and I said, "Is there any chance I can borrow your Horsebox?" And he was pretty keen, and very fortunately, a developer lent me their car park next to my offices in Knight Frank. And I used to sleep here, and then there was a gym around the corner where I used to go use the showers. But it was got quite embarrassing sort of waking up at 8:15 for my 2-minute descent to my office and have to bump into a few old boys who just didn't have the foggiest idea what I was up to, or why, the Knight Frank graduate salary package was so poor that this is what I was resorting to. Anyway, what my sort of key lessons I learned from this is a few things. I firstly think if you're prepared to get creative and put your hand out there and get stuck in, there are definitely options out there. I'm not promising they're going to be the most luxurious, but there are definitely ways of saving money and living in great locations, but you must accept there's going to be a few bits and pieces which you may not particularly like. And it sort of brought me onto this idea of livability. I'm also, and what's very interesting with my generation, is that we're actually, we're very flexible. I personally don't want to be tied into a 6-month rent. I'm actually quite happy sort of floating in and out, and I think our sort of transient nature, the way co-working space as well has just boomed, is because people no longer want to be tied in for a long period of time, at least within my generation. But what I did realise is there's a very little sort of permanent stock out there which we can say, here's a silver bullet, this is affordable. And I felt there's a real gap in the market. From this, I started getting more and more interested about the subject, and I started looking into ways on how we could create housing solutions. And I read about this. This is out in Amsterdam. And this used to be the sea until about 5 years ago. And Amsterdam, believe it or not, has also massive problems with sky-high rents. So what they've done to create more land is they've actually flooded a whole section of the sea. And there's a very nice girl who was about my sort of age who worked for a very large construction company called Heijmans. And she went to her boss one day saying, "This is ridiculous. I can't afford to live anywhere central. We need to do something about this." And she came up with this. And this is a prefab home. Again, you can see it being craned onto site there. It's actually split level, so you've got your bedroom up top, a very nice kitchen, bathroom, shower. They are currently being mass-produced off-site at the moment. They're renting them out for €550 per month, just by way in terms of what your average 1-bed in Amsterdam would cost you. It's about $1,200, so it's half the market rent. And a really interesting concept. And I got increasingly interested in this, and I started speaking to developers, and I went to go and talk to local councils, being like, if in theory I brought this concept here, would you let me put it on your land? And, people kind of like the sort of the political and the PR side of it. But the big problem with these is actually how you go about valuing this and actually getting the money to lend on having a site like this. While I was doing this, I got a phone call from a gentleman in our receiverships department at Knight Frank. And he said, we've just taken on a mansion on the Bishops Avenue. It's got an indoor pool. It's been vacant for the last 5 years. Do you know a property guiding company to manage it? And going back to my first stay in Gospel Oak, the company I stayed with were complete cowboys who were exploiting a market in the system, that there are people out there who, as long as it's at the right price, will be extremely forgiving for anything going wrong in there. And rather than putting it back to these guys, I thought it'd be quite a good idea to put it to myself. And Low Cost Guardians was born. I didn't really know much about the Bishops Avenue before moving here, but it's the most bizarre place. If you're into your sort of Arab sort of gold vibe from sort of the late 90s, this is a kind of vibe it's gone for. Had a pool. Unfortunately, because at the time it was being sold for a receivership, they didn't feel, they were very, very close to agreeing to get the pool up and running, because I was trying to persuade them that it'd be a great marketing tactic, when they were showing people around there. But unfortunately, the pool wasn't operational. We had some pretty interesting statues in there, and then that was one of the sort of jacuzzis going into one of the main rooms from there. And I started thinking about this, thinking, actually, for everything what young people want, and admittedly, the Guardian staying with me, they were on a 3-week notice period, just because that was my agreement with the client at the time, because it was being sold. This could actually be a potentially quite interesting model. So I put some branding together, and I thought I should go for this. And I pitched to a couple of clients who I'd known through my time at Knight Frank, and one of them very kindly, or maybe not really realising what he did, gave me this police station in Chelsea. So this is the sort of Lucan Place. It's a 30,000 square foot building. We've refurbed it to a pretty basic standard. Unfortunately, again, because I don't know how long I can have the building for, I can't go in there and spend a load of money on there. And what we've been really keen to do is create a new kind of model which is all about community. I believe if I have socially responsible, economically active young people living in this building, it gets well looked after. And this is a really interesting example in terms of the people I had sort of coming in here. We've got a lawyer, we've got 2 nurses who work at the Kensington and Chelsea Hospital, we've got a lot of guys in startups, and actually, there's a huge demand for this if it's properly managed. And that's something which I'm learning as I go on the job, but I very much feel this could be a potential future market. With the amount of vacant space there is kicking around in London, why are we not using space to its full potential? And rather than building upwards and outwards, which has so many political issues, let's utilise what we have already there.
Tim, thank you very much for that. That was excellent. Here's your one question.
Yep.
You have talked about how in your generation you're ultra flexible. And you've talked about your experiment of living in all these places. How happy would you be to carry on living like that for the next 10 years?
I suppose it comes down to, it's a very good question. It suits very much with my lifestyle at the moment. I don't have a mortgage, I'm not married, I have no children, and so I can be very selfish with my time and with the space I'm staying in. I completely agree, and I think for a certain age category this works wonderfully well. For older people as well, we have a cut-off of 30, just purely because it feels that actually once you go above that, it slightly distracts from the space in there. But I think there is there's opportunities. But then this leads us into how do we build affordable housing on a mass scale at the pricing out there, and that is something which a lot of people are struggling with at the moment.